Do well on that final. You will be happy about it at the end, I promise. Okay, so let's talk about the urinary system. So what is the urinary system? Well, it's made up of two kidneys, left and right. Let's stick with red. Okay, so we have two kidneys. We have one on the left, one on the right. Remember, they're both retroperitoneal. We have a tube coming from the kidney to the bladder called the ureter, two ureters, one bladder, one urethra. That is the entire urinary system. What does it do? What's the job of the urinary system? Well, it is going to take in all of our blood, and it is going to basically balance all of our body fluids, including blood, in order to achieve homeostasis. Okay, so the kidneys are like a huge filter as far as our electrolytes and fluid levels go in our body. So blood ionic composition, job of the kidneys, balance all those ions. Blood pH, kidney does it. Blood volume, kidney does it. Blood pressure, blood osmolarity. Hormones, it produces calcitrol and erythropoietin. Excretion of metabolic waste and blood glucose levels. So that is the job of the kidney. Anything blood related, whether it's volume or osmolarity or pH or electrolytes or everything, that's what the kidney does. Okay, big job. I know, big job. Okay, so they are retroperitoneal. If you look at this image right here on the left, notice this is the spine right here. Kidneys are behind everything in the abdomen. That's why they have their own protective covering, because they're not covered in peritoneum. If you're looking at the kidney from the side here, you'll notice that there's a little... Oh, that was awesome. That almost scared me for a minute. Whew. Okay. Everyone's awake now, though. I should actually, like, if you guys could do that every, like, 10 minutes or so, just to wake everybody up, get somebody to call. All right. Okay, so if you're looking at the kidney, you'll notice that there is one area right here in the middle in which everything goes in and out of the kidney, and that is the renal hilum, okay? So the renal artery goes in from the hilum. The renal vein leaves from the hilum. The ureter leaves from the hilum. The nerves going in and out of the kidney right here. Everything happens at the renal hilum. There's nothing coming in from anywhere else, okay? So that is important. Okay, so we are retroperitoneal. There is no peritoneal covering on the kidney. If you look at this picture on the left, this would be your peritoneum over here. It doesn't touch the kidney. So what does the kidney have? The kidney actually has its own 3 layers of protection, okay? On the very, very outside, the most superficial layer of protection is the renal fascia, and that is just a very thin layer of connective tissue. Its purpose is to help hold that kidney in place in relation to the rest of the abdomen. So it's kind of like a web that secures it in place. Just below the renal fascia is an adipose capsule. That is a capsule made of fat that is meant to protect the kidney from trauma and hold it up in place, holds the kidney in place. Now, why is that important? Well, because we are a society that is obsessed with weight loss, right? And there are instances where weight loss can be too rapid or too excessive. This is purely fat holding the kidney up. You lose weight way too fast, or you lose too much weight, or you have someone who's anorexic, they're liable to go through something called ptosis, in which the kidney will actually drop from its place. Yes, it happens. Yes, it's true. It's not a wives' tale. And that's because you have an adipose capsule surrounding that kidney meant to keep it in its place. That's why I don't ever try to lose weight, because I'm like, no, my kidneys are staying where they need to be. Thank you. You get put on bed rest and force fed for a little bit until you replace that fat, depending on why they drop though. And then if it's like an issue where, you know, sometimes they have to be like surgically, yeah, kept up, because you can't have them falling. You don't want kidneys falling. That ain't good. Yeah. Just don't lose weight. You'll be fine. Okay. And then the innermost layer. Yeah. The innermost layer is the renal capsule. That's the one that we all saw in lab. A lot of us thought that was visceral peritoneum for some reason, but oh well. That is the deepest layer, and it is also meant to protect from trauma and keep the kidneys nice shape. That capsule continues with the ureter when it leaves the kidney. Okay. Anatomy on the inside. What do we have on the inside? We already kind of know. We have a cortex and a medulla, right? Okay, so there are parts where that cortex from the outside dips into the medulla, and those parts that dip in are called renal columns. And when that happens, that cortex with the columns has actually divided the medulla into pyramid-shaped regions that all empty into one area, and we call those renal pyramids. What were you saying, Erica? I'm trying to read your lips. That's a space. It's a space. All right. I can do whatever I want. I'm not on camera. Okay. So, and here it is in picture form. So let's look at this right here. Okay, you have a cortex, that's a slight area. You have renal columns, that's where the cortex dips in. So these areas here are the columns. And then in the medulla, the middle part, you have these renal pyramids. Notice that each and every renal pyramid will all of the little nephrons in there, or collecting ducts, will empty into this one calyx, okay? And here's your pelvis, Erica. The space right here. So I'm going to erase that, and let's just talk a minute about how the kidney works. I know I've said this in lab, but I like to keep repeating it because, again, like I said, nobody ever really listens. So maybe subconsciously something might stick if I just keep saying it over and over. You did. No one except for Erica listens. Right here, this little yellow thing is the nephron. I pointed it out in lab, if anyone was awake then, okay? The nephron is the part that takes all of that blood, filters it, gets all the waste products out, gets all the, balances the electrolytes back and forth, and produces urine. So this is my functioning part. My nephron is producing urine, and then by the time you get to here, you now have urine, and then it all collects in this one pelvis. It all leads through this ureter and goes to the bladder, where it's stored until it's time to evacuate the bladder, and then it travels through the urethra. Okay, let's talk about the kidney. Blood supply to the kidney. So obviously it's the renal artery. You guys already know that from A&P1, I'm sure. But look, the mass of the kidney is only, it's like less than 0.5% of your total body mass. But the kidney receives 25% of your cardiac output. So 25% of all of the blood coming out of your heart goes to your kidneys. That's huge. That is a lot. Yes, and they're tiny. They're not very big. That is a lot. And that's because the job of the kidneys is to balance all of your fluids, including your blood. So that nephron that I talked about, that little unit, has a branch of an afferent arteriole that goes into the glomerulus, and then it leaves through an efferent arteriole, right? We're going to talk about the division of the arteries and veins in a minute, so don't freak out. But I just want to make the point of afferent is going in, efferent is leaving the glomerulus. What is the glomerulus? We're going to talk about it in a second. the nerve supply to the kidney. So most of the nerve supply to the kidney really is just your autonomic nervous system, okay? It's the autonomic nervous system, and that nerve supply is meant to regulate flow through the kidney, because through regulation of that flow into the kidney, we can regulate the urine volume and composition. Okay, so here's the blood supply of the kidney. Now, I'm going to break this chart down over here in the path to give you just the things that you really need to focus on. Know that you start with the renal artery. It goes into the kidney right here as the renal artery. Once it goes in, it starts splitting up into branches. We have branches like segmental, interlobular, arcuate, cortical, afferent, arterial. That's the one that goes into my glomerulus, which is part of my nephron, okay? So the afferent arterial goes in, divides up into thousands of little tiny capillaries. It's like a big ball of capillaries. And that's where filtration begins. And then those same capillaries will join each other again to give you one efferent arteriole. And then that efferent arteriole is going to join with other efferent arterioles. You're going to end up with peritubular capillaries, then venules, then cortical veins, and then arcuate veins, interlobular veins, and then you'll end in the renal vein, which is right here, leaving the kidney. Okay? So this is what is essential for you to understand, that you start with a renal artery, you end up with afferent arterioles that form glomerular capillaries that join each other to form an efferent arteriole, and then they're all going to join their neighbors until we end with the renal vein. Okay. Let's talk about the nephron, because the nephron is the microscopic functional unit of the kidney. This is the head honcho. This is all there is to the kidney. This is the most important part. So what is a nephron? Well, it's made up of two parts, a renal corpuscle and renal tubules. Corpuscle is the ball part, and then tubules is the rest of it. Okay? Corpuscle, tubules. Let's talk about the corpuscle. What makes up that corpuscle? Well, I have a glomerulus. What was the glomerulus? That was that afferent arteriole that went in and gave you glomerular capillaries, right? And then they all joined and became efferent. So the glomerulus is my glomerular capillaries, that bundle of capillaries. And I have a capsule, a glomerular capsule. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let me see, I'll talk about it in the next slide. Yeah, we talk about it in the next slide. Okay, so I have a ball or a network of capillaries right here, and then I have this, the capsule that surrounds it. Okay. Notice the capsule has two layers to it. It has a layer, I need a different color. It has a layer that is closest to the glomerulus right here. I'm tracing it in green. Okay? That is the visceral layer of the capsule. It also has a layer on the outside. Where the red arrow is, this stuff right here on the outside, that is the parietal layer of the capsule. Notice that the parietal layer of the capsule is what forms your tubules, or it's continuous with the tubules, okay? So that's the corpuscle, a glomerulus and a glomerular capsule. Let's talk about the tubules, because what happens is everything begins right here. This is where my filtration begins, but then it's fine-tuned. As the fluid is traveling through this tubule, it has to be fine-tuned, okay? So our tubules, you are going to have a proximal convoluted tubules. Proximal is the distance to the glomerulus. Convoluted is twisting and churning. I can find another word for it. That's your proximal convoluted tubule. You also have a distal convoluted tubule. Distal is the distance to the glomerulus. So the one further from the glomerulus is your distal convoluted tubule. Connecting the proximal and the distal convoluted tubules is a loop, and that is called the loop of Henle or the nephron loop. So now if I want to trace the flow of fluid that will eventually become urine, okay, it's going to start here in that glomerular capsule space, go into the proximal convoluted tubule, and then into the loop of Henle, and then into the distal convoluted tubule, and from there it goes into my calyx to be collected, my collecting ducts, calyx, urethra, ureter, bladder, urethra. Okay? All right. So why did we have to talk about all these different tubules? Because in reality, this is just the start. A lot of the work is done in, especially that proximal tubule, but a lot of the work is done in the tubule. They're all actively working so that at the end you have urine. Okay, so let's break them down now. Yes, you knew you wanted to break them down, right? Absolutely. Let's talk about it. The glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. So the glomerulus, what is it? It's a mass of capillaries that came from branching of that efferent arteriole, and then it's going to recombine to give you an efferent arteriole. Everyone's cool on that, right? Let's talk about the capsule, the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. What is that? Well, it is actually kind of special because, yes, it has two layers, a visceral layer that hugs up against the glomerulus and a parietal layer that's far away from the glomerulus, but there's a space between visceral and parietal layers. That's where the fluid flows. Not only that, but there are cells in that visceral layer called podocytes, and those podocytes almost look like little octopuses. They actually wrap themselves around the capillaries. That is cool, right? Because I love it. That was perfect timing. So the podocytes of the capsule can wrap around the capillaries. Okay, and this is important. You'll see why in the next slide, because that's where filtration begins. And then they're going to allow these podocytes, when they're hugging those capillaries, to begin with, those cells of the capillary are leaky. So there's stuff leaking out of the capillary. These podocytes are hugging up against it, and they have little hairs between their legs that act like a filtration, like a filter, like even the filter on any, like a coffee filter, whatever. They act as a filter, so when that fluid is leaking out, it is filtered, and then it leaks out into that space between the visceral and parietal layers of the capsule. Okay? All right, cool. So look at this. It's so cool. Up here it says endothelial cells. It's talking about the cells of the capillaries. Okay? I can't spell capillaries. Cells of the capillaries are leaky. They have holes in them. So they're allowing fluid to seep out of the blood that's in those capillaries. The podocytes of the capsule, those are the cells that make up the visceral layer of the capsule, form pedicels. Well, what is a pedicel, people? Look, you see the little legs that come out here of this cell? This is one podocyte here that I'm tracing, okay? So in between one leg and the next, there's little hairs or parts that come out. Those are pedicels. That is where I'm filtering things from, this space right here and here and here. Do you get what I'm saying? All of the spaces that look like they're covered in hair, under those hairs are the endothelial cells of the capillaries that are leaking. So now, because this cell has hugged a capillary, right, and there's stuff leaking out of the capillaries, it has provided this mesh for it to filter through and to go into this space right here. Does that make sense? Awesome. Okay. Let me erase it. So what's happening here in the glomerulus, all the pink stuff, this is the capillaries inside. The yellow stuff are the podocytes from that capsule. The filtrate, the filtrate is going to be coming out into this space and then leave through a tubule, the proximal convoluted tubule. No, why? Make sense? You're just trying to wrinkle your forehead for no reason? Okay. I need this to make sense because this is probably the hardest concept to understand of the entire kidney, of the entire urinary system. So if we don't understand it, please tell me so we can stay on it for a little bit longer. Do we understand it? Okay, thank you. Okay, so the glomerulus was formed by what? Capillaries from an afferent arteriole bringing blood in, right? Those capillaries, the walls of a capillary are made up of endothelial cells, okay? So endothelial cells are what make up the walls of a capillary. The endothelial cells in the glomerulus are not very good at holding stuff in. They're leaky. They've got big holes in them. They leak stuff all the time. So they're leaking fluid constantly. The capsule that surrounds a glomerulus, the very first layer that's touching the glomerulus, that's the visceral layer of the capsule, right, has cells called podocytes. Podocytes are like octopuses. They wrap themselves around these capillaries. And they've got fringe coming off of their arms, okay? That fringe acts like a filter, almost like you would run something through cheesecloth or run something through an air conditioning filter or any kind of filter, vacuum filter. So that fringe is called pedicels, right? It's coming off of a podocyte. The fluid, as it leaks from the endothelial cell of the capillary, it travels through the pedicels. That acts as a filtration slit. So that when you get to the space now, you have fluid that's already been filtered once. And what it does is it allows only the things that should leave. It lets large things like proteins and red blood cells, they don't get to pass. It's only the small stuff that can get through that filtration slit. So that's my first pass. In this picture? Let me blow it up for you. Okay. Do I remember how to do this? Shoot. You know, it's funny because I can always do it when I don't want to do it, but when I want to do it, I don't know how to do it. There's a way to do this. I do it all the time by accident. Come on. Three dots. No. Wait, maybe if I do it from here, laser pointer, then. Do what? It's funny because I do it when I don't want to do it, and then when I need to do it, I can't figure it out. Oh, here's a magnifying glass right there. I want to magnify it one more. It won't magnify any more than that. Is that good? Okay, so do I have a pen? Really? Okay, Erica, do you see the yellow here with the purple? The purple's the nucleus of the podocyte. The yellow stuff is the podocyte. Do what? Yes, that is the podocyte. The pink or the red stuff that's peeking in from under it, those are the endothelial cells of the capillary. You get it? Oh. So what we're saying is this is your afferent arteriole in here. It comes in, gives you a bunch of capillaries, right? And then those capillaries combine to form your efferent arteriole that leaves the glomerulus. So while the capillaries are in this capsule, those podocytes are all wrapped up on it. And so that whatever leaks out of the capillaries, out of those endothelial cells, has to pass through that filtration net right here. Okay. Now how do I get out of this and back to my, there we go. Make sense now? Okay, good. Everybody else feel good on it? Yes. Yeah, that's actually a really good question because it kind of ties into the rest of it. So in reality, I want to go to, actually I'm going to go to this one right here just for a minute, and I want to talk about what's really happening. So in reality, it starts here, right? The fluid in the space that's been filtered out. And your question was, well, what happens after that, basically? Okay, so notice that the capillary, the afferent brought in fluid and blood. It was filtered here the first time. And then that efferent arteriole, look what happens to the artery, the arteriole as it, as it leaves. Notice that you have arteries or capillaries all around the tubules. And that's important because this fluid that started in that glomerular space, while it's traveling through the tubules, it is exchanging things with the capillaries that lie next to it. Does that make sense? Yes. So yes, we did filter out at the glomerulus, but that was just the first filtrate. And the entire time, while it's traveling through the proximal convoluted tubule, some at the loop of Henle, different things are being exchanged. Because when you do that first pass and you take all of that excess fluid, there's going to be stuff you have to put back into the body. Things like glucose. We don't pass that in urine. So we shove glucose back into the capillaries. We may need more electrolytes. We'll take electrolytes from what's traveling in those capillaries. So as it started in the glomerulus, but it doesn't end there. It keeps going as it's traveling through the tubules until you get to the end, and then you have just the waste products that you need in there, and you've taken back everything. Okay? All right, so, but let's cover this, and then we'll talk about how that urine is formed. Let's just talk about two different types of nephrons. So we know the nephron is my main filtration unit of the kidney. It's what does everything. The glomerulus, the glomerular capsule, the tubules, proximal, distal, and the loop. I have two different types of nephrons depending on where that glomerulus is found and how deep the loops go. This is a cortical nephron. Notice that this is the cortex here, right? And this down here is the medulla. A cortical nephron is your average run-of-the-mill nephron. 80% or more of our nephrons are going to be cortical nephrons. The glomerulus is sitting nice right in the cortex where it should be. Notice that you have your convoluted tubule, your distal, you got your loop, and then you have your distal convoluted tubule. Notice that the loop dips in just a little bit into that medulla. Right? It doesn't go very far. Okay. That's what most of our nephrons are. Now, we also have a nephron that can be a juxtamedullary nephron. So the juxtamedullary nephron is a nephron who starts much closer to the medulla. It's just right on the border of the medulla. So here it is. The other one was up here, your cortical one. This is a juxtamedullary nephron. In addition to it starting right before the medulla, the loop is really long. And look how far it goes. It goes all the way to the end of the medulla. And because the loop is so long and so far into the medulla, this juxtamedullary nephron is going to produce a very concentrated urine. Okay? If that's confusing right now, we can come back to it after we talk about how urine is formed and do a recheck, because this ties into what Trinity was asking about. Well, where does the blood go after that? And keep in mind that notice that you have capillaries up here in the cortex. You have capillaries in the medulla, right? But your capillaries here in the cortex are mainly exposed to glomeruli, right? So it's like a first pass. It's very similar to blood, what they're filtering out. As you get deeper into the kidney and you go deeper into the medulla, those capillaries have already passed through some filtration by the tubules and the glomeruli that were above it. So when you get down here, you're like at the depths of it. It's already had stuff taken out of it. So now it's more concentrated. So now when I try to take things out of it or put into it, it's already going to be concentrated. And that's why that, combined with the length of that tubule that's constantly taking things or exchanging things, you end up with a more concentrated urine. Okay? Don't let it confuse you. If anything, just remember that the majority of our nephrons are cortical nephrons. They're giving us urine that is very similar to blood, right? And then your juxtamedullary nephrons are the ones that have a super long loop. They're found at the border of the cortex and the medulla, and they will give you very concentrated urine. Okay. Are we okay so far? Kind of, sort of, maybe? Okay. This also, I don't want it to confuse you. I just want you to know that there is something called a Juxtaglomerular Apparatus. What is it? Let me show you. So here is your afferent. This is a glomerulus again. Here's your afferent arteriole coming in, your efferent going out, right? Right where the blood is coming in, you have a tubule, okay, that touches that afferent arteriole. In that tubule, right where it touches, there's an area where the cells are packed in really tight. It's from here to here. That is called the macula densa. And it's there for a reason, because in that macula densa, you have cells that have the ability to detect the pressure of the blood that's coming into the glomerulus. And this is a way that the kidney regulates itself. If the blood pressure that's coming into here is too high, those cells can react, right? Cause that arteriole to dilate so the blood pressure goes down. If it's too low, those cells can react, cause that arteriole to constrict, so the pressure in it goes up. So it's a mode of auto-regulation, and we will come back to that mode of auto-regulation later on towards the end, probably on next week. But I just want you to be familiar with what the juxtaglomerular apparatus is, and that's what it is. It is an internal regulation that is done between the cells of this tubule in the macula densa and that afferent arteriole, and it is meant to regulate blood flow through the glomerulus. Cool? I'm seeing some very unhappy faces, and I'm actually glad for the first time that I don't have a class full of students right now. Because I think I've seen enough negativity right now. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, cool. Okay. Whew. All right. I am going to start this right here. And then if we have to come back to it, we will. But this is what we've been touching on the whole time. How is urine actually formed from the blood that's traveling into the kidney? So, and I'm not, you don't need to worry about the words just yet. I want you to focus on what's happening here. Here's my afferent arteriole. Blood comes in, right? It gets here. What does it do? It makes that ball of capillaries. And remember, endothelial cells are leaking. Podocytes have the filtration slits, fluids coming out. The fluid comes into the capsule space, right? So that's my first step. That is glomerular filtration, right there. Okay. Sorry. In this glomerular filtration, pretty much anything small can get through, right? Everything comes out. It's the large stuff, like the big cells, the proteins, the things that can't pass that first filtration slit, right? So we end up with a lot of stuff in here after glomerular filtration. Some of that stuff my body needs, like, say, glucose. So what happens in that tubule is I'm going to take my glucose, say, and put it back into my capillary that's traveling next to the tubule. That is called reabsorption. Now, let's say I took in glucose, but glucose said, hey, I don't travel by myself. My best friend sodium comes with me every time. So glucose ends up into blood, right? But it brings sodium with it. But then the bouncer comes up and says, whoa, sodium is underage. I'm sorry, sodium, you need to leave. That's what sodium gets sent back into the tubule. That is what we call secretion. Okay. Now, the idea of filtration happens in the glomerulus only. That's your first thing, filtration. After you filter, you readjust by either reabsorption, taking things back into the bloodstream, or secretion, putting things back into the tubule. Okay? That constant absorption and reabsorption and secretion is happening the whole time we're traveling through these tubules. But get what I'm saying? Okay, cool. So, glomerular filtration is highly dependent on several factors, which we will actually discuss next week, right? The main thing that drives it is the pressure of the blood coming in through here. If that pressure is high, that's a high force, you're going to push things through that filter much faster, right, than you would if the pressure was low. The hydrostatic pressure is the pressure that's inside the capsule here. If I already have fluid in there and I'm trying to push stuff against that fluid, it's going to slow me down. It's okay if this doesn't make sense just yet because we're going to do it in detail. Water and the smaller molecules are all going to come out right here. Water and small molecules will be really easy to jump right out into this filtrate. And then as it travels through, I am reabsorbing and secreting. Reabsorbing back into the blood or secreting it back out. Okay? This is the basis of everything the kidney does. Do we understand that? Cool. Awesome. In one day, 150 to 180 liters will pass through each glomerular capsule. Remember, the capsule is microscopic. Your glomerulus is microscopic. That is huge, right? Yeah, that's a big deal. Okay. And that is what we're going to base, what we're going to do in next week is break this down to talk about specifically what happens in each of those things, or a few of the processes that happens in them. And I'm not even going to start glomerular filtration because that is something we can save to next week. Sorry. Yeah, because it'll just confuse you and make you miserable for the rest of the